In the early centuries, to be known was to be marked. A Christian could hide among neighbors, pass as ordinary, disappear into crowds. A bishop could not. His name was spoken aloud. His face was recognized. His presence drew attention like a flame in darkness. Simply being identified was enough to invite death. Rome did not fear ideas alone. It feared structure. A faith without leaders was a rumor. A faith with bishops was a body. Bishops baptized, reconciled, ordained, and guarded memory. They were anchors. And anchors, once spotted, could be torn out. A bishop walking openly was not bold by temperament. He was bold by necessity. He carried the weight of a community that could scatter at any knock on the door. If he fled, the flock fractured. If he stayed, the danger became focused, mercifully concentrated on one life instead of many. This was the moral disruption. Leadership itself became a form of sacrifice. Authority was no longer a shield. It was a target. Rome understood this instinctively. When persecutions flared, officials did not ask first for believers. They asked for names. "Where is your bishop?" That question turned households silent. To the empire, bishops were agitators. To the church, they were witnesses whose very visibility testified to something stronger than survival. Their deaths were not accidents of policy. They were logical conclusions. A man who could not be hidden could only be eliminated. And yet, men continued to accept this role. Not because they desired martyrdom, but because the church could not remain a body without a visible heart. Each generation raised new bishops knowing exactly what identification might cost. This was not heroism rehearsed for applause. It was fidelity lived under the shadow of execution. Rome named bishops dangerous not because they carried weapons, but because they carried coherence. In a fragmented movement, a bishop unified belief, discipline, and hope. He was accused of stubbornness, sedition, arrogance. The accusations did not need refinement. They needed usefulness. A bishop who refused to sacrifice to the emperor was labeled defiant. One who refused to hand over scriptures was accused of obstinacy. His refusal did not look like humility to Roman eyes. It looked like insolence wrapped in piety. The empire called this moral disease. Contagion required containment. The naming of evil sharpened the hunt. Once identified, a bishop could not plead ignorance. He was assumed guilty before questioning began. His office was proof. To lead Christians was to confess opposition to Rome's sacred order. The logic was efficient and merciless. Communities felt the pressure immediately. Houses that once welcomed the bishop now feared him. His arrival could doom them all. Children were hushed. Doors were bolted. Love was weighed against survival. Bishops felt this burden acutely. Their presence brought grace and danger. Some authorities offered compromise, a quiet sacrifice, a public gesture. No one needed to know. Mercy, framed as reason, hovered close. But to accept would fracture the church internally. A bishop's silence would echo louder than his death. The tension grew unbearable because it exposed the heart of authority. Rome demanded visible loyalty. The church demanded visible truth. The bishop stood at the intersection, absorbing the collision. When arrested, he was not treated as an individual criminal, but as a symbol that needed to be broken publicly. Naming bishops evil allowed Rome to justify swift executions. It also forced Christians to confront an unsettling reality. Leadership meant exposure. There would be no anonymity for shepherds. The role itself invited the cross. The church did not deny this. It absorbed it, slowly learning that survival would depend on leaders willing to be seen, and therefore willing to die. Some officials noticed something unsettling about these men. Bishops did not behave like rebels. They did not incite violence or rally crowds. When arrested, they did not resist. They spoke calmly, sometimes even gratefully, as though the trial were an expected appointment. One magistrate watched a bishop refuse to curse Christ despite repeated opportunities. The man was not young. His body bore the marks of age and care. He could have saved himself with a word. Instead, he spoke of responsibility. To God, to his flock, to the truth entrusted to him. The magistrate recognized integrity, even if he despised its object. These insiders were disturbed because bishops inverted Roman logic. Power did not protect them. Visibility condemned them. And yet they did not flee visibility. They accepted it as part of their calling. This defied instinct. Some officials began to understand that executions did not weaken the church as expected. Removing a bishop caused grief, but it also clarified devotion. Communities mourned, then chose successors. The structure regenerated. The violence revealed not fragility, but depth. A few insiders began to listen. They heard that bishops were chosen not for ambition, but for stability. That many resisted ordination until compelled. That leadership was a burden shared reluctantly. This did not fit the caricature of power-hungry agitators. The escalation reached a point where killing bishops became routine, yet unresolved. Rome could remove leaders, but could not erase the idea of leadership rooted in sacrifice. Each execution sharpened the contrast. Roman authority killed to preserve order. Episcopal authority died to preserve unity. The righteous insider felt the unease settle deeper. If these men were evil, why did they die so cleanly? Why did their deaths feel heavier than the verdicts that condemned them? Rome had not expected to confront conscience in chains. As persecutions intensified, bishops descended further into danger. They moved at night. They changed routes. They entrusted letters to children. Their lives became patterns of caution without cowardice. Every visit might be the last. The descent was interior as well. Bishops wrestled with fear, not for themselves, but for those attached to them. Arrest meant interrogations that spread outward. Names could be extracted, communities could unravel. Some bishops surrendered themselves to spare others. This choice carried no public recognition, only loss. In prisons, bishops prayed not for release, but for steadiness. Their writings from confinement reveal no bitterness, only concern for order and unity. Even while facing execution, they worried about false teaching, division, despair. Leadership did not cease at arrest. It intensified. Rome interpreted this persistence as obstinacy. From within the church, it was continuity. The bishop's role did not end at the courtroom door. It extended into death. Martyrdom became the final act of oversight. The conflict deepened because bishops could not be replaced instantly. Their deaths created gaps. Authority faltered briefly. Confusion crept in. Heresies found openings. Rome believed this proved effectiveness. In truth, it revealed cost. Leadership mattered precisely because its absence was felt. Yet the church adapted. Councils formed. Succession was clarified. The role of bishop became even more defined under pressure. Death refined structure. The descent into persecution carved the church into a shape that could endure. Bishops learned to live prepared. Every homily could be a farewell. Every Eucharist a last communion. This awareness stripped leadership of illusion. What remained was service under threat. The bishop's identity fused with witness. Rome pressed harder, believing collapse imminent. Instead, it encountered a church whose leaders had already surrendered the one thing Rome could threaten: their lives. The descent reached its depth when fear lost its leverage. At the height of persecution, mercy was offered strategically. A bishop could save his life by renouncing office, by sacrificing quietly, by disappearing. The offer was presented as generosity, Why waste a life so useful? Why insist on public defiance? This mercy felt unjust because it misunderstood the nature of episcopal identity. A bishop was not merely a man with beliefs. He was a sign. To deny publicly would wound the church more deeply than his death. Mercy demanded a betrayal more damaging than execution. Some bishops accepted exile. Others refused compromise. The refusals were not dramatic. They were sorrowful. Bishops understood the grief their deaths would cause. They also understood the fracture silence would introduce. The climax unfolded in trials, where the outcome was already determined. Bishops spoke briefly. They did not argue theology. They stated allegiance. The simplicity unnerved judges. There was no rhetoric to dismantle, only presence. Executions followed. Crowds watched. The empire expected fear to spread. Instead, resolve hardened quietly. The mercy Rome offered exposed its own injustice. A system that spared life only at the cost of truth revealed its emptiness. The church absorbed the loss. Communities gathered at graves. Successors were chosen under threat. The cycle repeated. Rome had reached the height of its pressure. Beyond this point, violence lost novelty. God's action in this climax was restraint. He did not intervene visibly. He allowed leadership to be consumed. This was the scandal. Mercy from heaven looked like abandonment. Yet within this silence, the church learned something irreversible. Leadership was not about preservation but fidelity. The climax was not victory but clarity. Bishops died not because God was absent, but because truth had been entrusted to visible lives. And visible lives, once marked, could not be spared without distortion. Even before persecutions eased, bishops gave thanks. Letters from prison speak of gratitude, not resentment. Thanksgiving was not tied to outcome. It was rooted in communion. Communities learned to celebrate Eucharist with leaders already condemned. Every gathering carried weight. The bishop presided, knowing he might not return. Thanksgiving preceded survival. Gratitude came before relief. Over time, persecutions waned. Identifying bishops no longer guaranteed execution. The empire changed, slowly, unevenly. But the church that emerged was shaped by blooded leadership. Bishops were no longer administrators alone. They were witnesses by inheritance. When peace finally came, episcopal authority carried memory. It remembered what visibility had cost. The role remained public, but never casual again. Thanksgiving had prepared the church for recognition without intoxication. Victory, when it arrived, felt restrained. The church had already learned to live without safety. Power would not erase that lesson. Leadership would always carry the echo of risk. The story leaves a question suspended in silence. What does it mean to be seen? Early bishops were executed simply for being identified. Visibility was the price of fidelity. God does not ask every believer to stand so exposed, but He asks the same question of every heart. When faith becomes visible, when loyalty can be named, what will you do with that exposure? The bishops answered without speeches. They allowed their names to be spoken, their faces to be recognized, their lives to be taken. God did not rescue them from this cost. He allowed leadership to pass through death so the church could learn what authority truly meant. The question remains, will faith retreat into safety, or will it accept the risk of being known? God still waits for the answer, not in triumph, but in quiet, where visibility and trust meet. O Lord of the shepherds, we thank you for the bishops who bore your name in public and accepted the cost. Grant us courage to remain faithful when truth makes us visible, humility to lead without seeking safety, and trust to follow you even when protection is withdrawn. May we honor their witness, not with words alone, but by living a faith unashamed to be seen and steady under the weight of your calling. Amen.